folks, welcome back to Indaba Africa. This is Chris once again. Hey folks, welcome back to Chris Wide Africa here on the Indaba Africa channel, part of the Indaba Broadcasting Network. I'm Chris once again, and I'm here in central Pennsylvania. My special feature guest today is one we've been coordinating with for a few weeks. He had to attend a funeral, family business there to take care of, unfortunately, so we had to reschedule. And then my hiatus from YouTube, my unintended vacation for a number of days there, kind of put the kibosh. And Josh has the distinction of being the only guest that I've ever had to beg off on. Even in the midst of all the chaos that happened that week, I was able to get all the other interviews. But frankly, with everything going on, I thought it best to cover this topic, not in a rushed fashion. So here we are today. It is the 10th of March, 2021, and my guest is from the Heritage Foundation. And I'm going to butcher his last name, even though he's told me how to pronounce it, and I know how to, but it's Josh Meservey. I've got it wrong. Josh, how's it going? And get your surname right since I messed it up.
Yeah, doing well. Thanks, Chris. So Meservey.
Meservey.
But you gave the classic mispronunciation of it. So you're very consistent with everybody else.
Well, the problem is, of course, I speak French and it throws me off. That's why I'm so confused. But welcome to the program. A lot of my viewers are very excited. None of them can't be here today because of load shedding in South Africa, but also other commitments. And they've told me that, hey, I'm going to catch this show, but we'll catch it afterwards. So we kind of expect to see a larger audience after this stream. Anyway, so you worked at the Atlantic Council, I think, for a bit, and also worked with, I think, maybe with U.S. Special Forces Commander, somebody like that previously, and now you're at the Heritage Foundation. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you got to where you're at? Because you're now responsible for Africa program at the Heritage Foundation, correct?
Yeah, exactly. So I started off my Africa career, I guess, as a Peace Corps volunteer in Zambia, up in the north, Luapula province, doing agriculture and forestry type activities. 2.5 years there, moved to Kenya, another 2.5 years there, based usually out of Nairobi, doing refugee work. Came back to the States, master's degree, went to the Atlantic Council, as you mentioned, then over to Heritage, where I've been for about 5 years now. One of those time flies moments whenever I say I've been there for 5 years. And at Heritage, I am in charge of the Africa program, which is a fancy way of saying I'm the only dedicated Africa analyst at the institution. But
don't tell me
right, exactly. But it's actually great because that means I have a lot of flexibility and a lot of autonomy to set the direction of research that we're doing. Heritage is unique among most think tanks in that it has a single voice policy. So that means whenever I write something, the entire weight of the organization is behind it, which is terrific. So that's all to the good.
Well, in fact, Heritage is different than, say, some other groups. I mean, it's more of a conservative organization. I think it's a fair statement. Whereas the Brookings Institution claims to be neutral, but they are anything but neutral. If you read what they put out, they're a little bit to the left of the spectrum. Having read some more carrying the water for the current administration reports that came out, and also what I think is somewhat of a distortion about the Texas power situation, in which they blame it on the hydrocarbon industry. And there's some blame to be shared there, but 63% of the electricity generation in Texas is coming from natural gas, which, although it's a hydrocarbon, is considered green energy by most people, and wind power. So 63%. And the article from Brookings says that it's because of the oil and gas industry. That's why there's no electricity. Anyway, we won't get into that, but we're here to talk about China and Africa today. So Heritage, how is that? Are you enjoying that experience?
I am. I love Heritage. I really do. I've never been in an organization that tries so hard to look after its people and does successfully. You're right. It's absolutely unapologetically a conservative organization. We splash that all over our website and always talk about it. But we are nonpartisan. So we have a political philosophy in the sense of conservatism, but that doesn't mean that we always agree with Republicans, for instance, or we always disagree with Democrats. Most conservatives are on the Republican side. So understandably so, we end up agreeing more with Republicans than we do with Democrats, but we're happy to work with both sides. We just want to see conservatism advanced, and that's our mission, including for foreign policy issues.
That's actually a good distinction, but let me make a few notes here. Conservative organizations, supports civil work for them. Did my CV arrive there yet? I'm just checking. No.
Yeah, I'll keep an eye out.
Okay, thanks a lot. Appreciate it. No, but seriously, you make a very important distinction, which is increasingly not done by people in today's political debate, and that is the fact that you're conservative. I'm a conservative, but that doesn't make me a Republican. Now, happen to be a registered Republican, but only because I wanted to vote in the primary last year. I've been an independent for 30 years. And so it's an important distinction. And historically, conservatives were on both sides of the aisle. I mean, you look at people like Zell Miller and even Joe Lieberman, and many of his positions are very conservative, members of the Democratic Party. And there were plenty of Democrats who were members of the Democratic Party who were political conservatives. They just had different views on certain things. But that's becoming increasingly polarized, and fewer Democrats identify as conservative, and it's hard to find any these days. So it's understandable why you're on that side. But I think you're making a very important distinction for my viewing audience to understand, is that conservative doesn't mean Republican. There's a difference.
Right.
Yeah, that's an important one. So China and Africa. Let's talk about that. But let me throw a few pieces of mud out the wall and get your thoughts on it. And this is my views on it. I've worked with the Chinese in Africa. I worked with them in Liberia intentionally. And when they thought they were being clever and collecting information, I was actually giving them because we wanted them to know it. But anyway, so I've done on both levels. And I've also worked with them in other places and also had to deal with the frustrations of Chinese strategic policy in Africa as well. But it seems to me over the years that an awful lot of smart people in the Beltway always want to talk about China and Africa and always turn it into a competition. And what I tell people from my perspective is that competition, we ceded the ground. Where are we competing? We are not competing with China and Africa. We're not competing with anybody in Africa by and large, unless you're Boeing, Caterpillar, or John Deere, or maybe Microsoft or Google. The rest of the country is kind of asleep while Africa is moving along. And we're not really competing with them. It's very few spaces, in my view, that we actually compete. Now, people talk about it all the time. But then if you go back 15 years ago, all the smart people in the Beltway were talking about West Africa will be critically important to us by the year 2010 because 25% of all U.S. oil will come from West Africa. Therefore, it's strategically important for us. And I'm like, no, it's a fungible commodity bought on world markets, and thankfully it's priced in dollars, which is a huge, benefit to us. We don't have to pay drachmas, where they don't exist anymore, or rand, or or rubles. We get to pay in dollars. But I argued against that, and I was right. But I didn't predict fracking and tight oil and all that. Yeah. Who knew? But that not the reason why I thought didn't think it was going to happen. But I've been swimming upstream against all these people in the Beltway and outside the Beltway, talking about China and Africa. China's a real issue in Africa. We'll talk about that. But I don't see China as a competitor because we're not trying to compete against them. We say we are, but we're not really. And so with that, let me turn it over to you and get some of your thoughts about China in Africa. Just some general statements up front, and then we'll tease it out. It's more of a conversation than an interview, so let's see how it goes. Yeah,
absolutely. So, right. I agree on your point about competition. I think the Chinese have been competing with us. Yes, we just have failed to realize that's what's going on.
Al-Qaeda was competing with us too, and we just dismissed them.
Right, exactly. Yeah, precisely. So I find it so strange, this narrative that took hold several years ago when the Trump administration was trying very hard to elevate the importance of this strategic competition with China. You saw this. You saw the administration's actions framed all the time as Trump administration, attacking China or something along those lines, right? And my thought was always, look, China has been competing with us since 1949, basically, when it became the PRC. Like, you could go back and read things that Mao said. Now, they were competing with the Soviets as well, but, they've always viewed the U.S. As a strategic competitor. That's sort of waxed and waned in importance in their foreign policy, but fundamentally, that's always been a baseline. We in the West, we see the world very differently, and we don't understand sometimes that other powers don't view the world the same way we do. So we always thought, look, if we're just really nice to Beijing and we draw them into this liberal international order that the US has led for so long, they'll loosen up, they'll become more democratic as they, reap prosperity and et cetera, et cetera. That was really the dominant narrative, right? For probably a couple decades even in DC and I think elsewhere. Only very recently have the scales fallen from our eyes, and we've seen that's just not true. Like the Chinese Communist Party has a very clear strategic vision of the world, and that does not align with the US's and most of the free world's vision for a global order. And they view sort of overtures and concessions as weakness fundamentally. Now, there are other regimes like this as well. I think Putin's regime would be a good example, probably Kim Jong-un in North Korea. But they just see the world in very zero-sum terms. And they've been behaving that way while we have been offering concessions, and thinking that, well, if we just cooperate a little bit more, give a little bit more, they'll come along. It's not true. It's not happening. And so I think finally the US is wising up to that. I think some European countries are as well. And certainly in Asia, they've had much less sanguine view of Beijing for a long time because they have a history there. They've seen how aggressive and expansionist Beijing has been, and bullying and intimidating and everything else. So, so I agree. We have not been in the game in any strategic sense. Now, I do want to caveat that by saying we are active in Africa for sure.
Oh yeah.
And I always push back on people in DC. Yet another narrative in DC is that, well, the US withdrew and we're blah blah blah. It's like, that's not true. Like PEPFAR, MCC, Power Africa.
Challenge. The list goes on and on and on and on. For the last 20 years, we've been more engaged in Africa than their entire history of our country. And it all started with George Bush, ironically.
Yeah, PEPFAR, under George W. Bush, literally saved millions of African lives. It's a wonderful program. When I was in Peace Corps, which is what I was doing in Zambia, we were, even though I was an agriculture program, we were still significantly funded by PEPFAR. And so we actually had an HIV/AIDS component to what we were doing. And so the US should be hugely proud of what we accomplished and continue to accomplish. That's an extant program that continues to this day. So we have a lot of these really significant programs, meaningful programs on the continent. Now, the problem is, we haven't been strategic about our engagements. So they've sort of been a bit ad hoc and not drawn together,
and they also tend to be bilateral.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Even if they're Pan-African in the sense of like PEPFAR, we still engage bilateral, which is fine. That's fine. There's no problem with that. But sometimes you do want to look at engaging more multilaterally, particularly with allies, which is a strategic advantage for the United States, right? Like, it's our alliance system.
Right. My point, though, with the bilateral pieces, I don't have objection to that because PEPFAR is a good example of how a global program with a global AIDS coordinator can work, and you can execute it bilaterally. It works very well in that case. But my point is that it's ironic that the nation that invented television and Hollywood and mass media and advertising, this is where it all started, that we are abysmal at strategic communications. In fact, we're so abysmal at it that people in DC are allergic to the term strategic communications when it's a perfectly viable term. And I've been involved in strategic communications for decades for our country. And I find it abysmal, or I see that it's abysmal, the way that we do this. The State Department, despite having public diplomacy officers, does a very poor job of messaging with Africa, with the African Union, even though we have an embassy there. We don't effectively do this, and we don't leverage our programs. All the time I keep hearing about China. China is building all the infrastructure. Well, who do you think has been building it since 1960? We have. We have been building it to the tune of trillions of dollars. We, the Western developed world, I should say. So, we've been the ones out there, and all we hear about is the beating and railing against the IMF and World Bank. But people forget that that's because countries stole money, misappropriated, misused it, and ran their economies poorly. And we're looking out for the interest of Africans. And when you talk about China, great. So China built the airport in Gaborone. Well, there'd be nobody to fly at the airport if it hadn't been for PEPFAR. I'm embellishing. I'm being facetious, but tens of millions of Africans are alive because of our generosity and our programs and their efforts to make use of that. And that's just, China builds a dam and they're the hot, shiny story of the day. But there's a lot more to what's going on in Africa than what people see in the newspapers.
Yeah, and you've hit on a really important point here, one that I also have written about and talk about frequently, is this idea of strategic communications, right? So we were just talking about all these programs the US has. No one knows about them. I say no one, I'm exaggerating, but like on the continent, we get very little credit for all of those programs that we do on the continent. And I was talking to a USAID official some months ago, and he said, yeah, I was just in, I think it was Kenya or somewhere in East Africa, and people there thought PEPFAR was an NGO. They thought it was an independent NGO. They didn't know it was associated with the US government. And to me, that was such a
Speaks
good
volumes.
example
That
of this.
speaks volumes.
Yeah,
Okay.
exactly. Right. Like it's a microcosm of this problem we have where we're so poor at tooting our own horn a little bit and saying, look, like the US is engaged. We are here with you. Here are all the things that we've tried to help you with as partners and coming alongside. And I think there's some resistance to that in the bureaucracies of the U.S. government because it feels icky, like we should just be these completely pure-hearted, unself-interested humanitarians. But that's not the role of a government. I'm sorry, like if that's what your government's doing, yep, your government's failing you. Honestly, like governments exist fundamentally to protect and advance the interests of their own people. Like that is the fundamental purpose of a government. So, I think the American people are generally really good-hearted. And if you look at like private philanthropic giving, Americans outstrip every other country by orders of but massively, many times over. So there is a very strong charitable impulse, which we should be proud of. But the US government exists to serve the interests of Americans. And absolutely. I think the world is actually better off for that because we define our interests in very broad and broad terms that embrace things like human rights and democracy and capitalism and prosperity and peace. So I think sometimes there's a little bit of that resistance, right? Like these are humanitarian programs. We shouldn't be trying to use them to advance America's interests. Like that's foolishness. Like, of course we should be, that's why they do indeed exist to help other people, but they also exist to help Americans. Well, who pay for them.
Exactly. But that's the thing that's driven me nuts. Let me give you two more examples, anecdotal examples of how how the message gets lost and why I think we're so abysmal at this. Number one is that the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act is 20 years old. Mm-hmm. Whenever I hear African intellectuals talk about fair trade, I'm like, excuse me, your country is qualified for AGOA. You have import-free duty access to our market for 7,000 products and services. When I send my chicken parts to South Africa, they're not duty-free. I have to pay tariff. I sent a box as a personal individual, a gift to someone in South Africa. They were Trump hats, by the way. He wanted them. Anyway, so Trump hats, they didn't know that. And some coffee samples from Starbucks because the guy wanted to try it. So I sent that. I had to pay a fortune to send it there. Then they had to pay 43% import duty for a personal gift. Yeah. But anything coming from South Africa, I order rugby jerseys, there's no taxes because we allow their goods in our country duty-free. So when I hear people whine about duty-free and fair trade, shove it. You don't know what you're talking about. You have access to our marketplace. We grant you. Now, the amount of trade between the U.S. and Africa is a rounding error in our economy, so it doesn't harm us. But it is a great benefit for Africans to take advantage of it. But the two things I want to tell you about this is, number one, AGOA is 21 years old. Most people in Africa never even heard of AGOA. Even people in business, they don't know what it is. And in addition to that, I went to the Trading with Africa Summit in Chicago a couple years ago where I spoke at. And we had people there who were from Africa and Africans in America who were engaged in business and Americans who are interested in Africa. And almost none of them knew that the Import-Export Bank facilitates grants and loans to businesses to do trade with Africa. 21 years after. Now, that's been going on longer. So that's a go. And here's the other one. This is an anecdotal story, so you got to stick with me on a second here. At the U.S. Africa Command, when I left Africa and went up there to work as the head of the Southern Africa Division, I was up there and I was invited to a lunch. Now, Africa Command ran a program for several years in which they brought broadcast and print journalists from all over Africa to Africa Command. They got to meet the commander. They get an hour and a half of the commander's time, a four-star general, ask any question they want. Nothing was off the table. They were taken into every branch and bureau of the Africa Command except for the intelligence. But they were even taken there and given an unclassified briefing about what the intelligence people do. They just couldn't go behind the wire. So unfettered access, they could write whatever they wanted. Now, that was brilliant, and I thought that was at least a thought towards strategic communications by Africa Command. But here's the thing. I sat down to lunch because they asked me to go with some Kenyans and Zambians who were there from media. And one of the Zambians has told me, this was when Obama was president, he says, no, Barack Obama, he's done all this for Africa. Now, this is in his second term, already starting. And I held my tongue. I'm like, because at this point, he hadn't delivered anything. Power Africa hadn't happened yet. His little summit was just coming on board. So virtually no attention to Africa whatsoever at this point. Everything going on in Africa, by and large, was a continuation of what existed when he took over. Kind of like with Trump, it was a continuation. So I just held my tongue. And then all these other people, a couple of Zambians and Kenyans like, excuse me? What are you talking about? What has Barack Obama done for Africa? I don't know. PEPFAR. That was George Bush. Millennium Challenge. George Bush. the millennial count, for tuberculosis malaria. All these things, George Bush, and I'm not a George Bush fan. The point is that we had done such a poor job of selling it. A journalist in Zambia, now he's probably not the best journalist, but a journalist in Zambia thought that Barack Obama was responsible for all these programs that predate the guy by 8 years, 10 years. Anyway, so it's that's just two anecdotal examples of just how poor we do strategic communications. They shouldn't feel dirty and slimy. You should tell people what you do so they don't, and remind them. So when they start forgetting, that they remember, because what happens is if you don't tell people, you get distorted narratives.
Yeah. There's a really interesting bureaucratic element to this as well. I've heard that there are something like 13 different brands that get put on the different streams of humanitarian development aid that we send to Africa. And each of those brands, of course, represents a discrete agency or that has some sort of equity in this, and they all defend those to the death, right? Because it's bureaucratic turf wars, and it's very hard. I've been told by someone who should know that to unify these into a single American brand, where you just slap it on every piece of American aid that goes to the continent. So, I think there's bureaucratic problems here. There's strategic problems, obviously, and to bring it back to China. China is very disciplined about its strategic communications, and it has strategic communications. It's actually hideously boring, frankly, to read official Chinese communication to the continent, because they always say the same thing over and over and over and over again. I mean, they hammer it.
Oh yeah, and it's mind-numbing.
Yeah, I bet every African on the continent could repeat some of those phrases, right? Like win-win cooperation and warm, friendly tide, et cetera, et cetera. But it does bespeak it does demonstrate the discipline and the importance that China places on their strategic communications. And look, I give the Chinese government a lot of credit for their strategic thinking. I really do. Like they invest in it. They spend a lot of time creating strategies, and then they're very disciplined. Now they're not at all invincible or perfect. That's not what I'm suggesting here. They can be very ham-handed and klutzy, frankly, on the continent and elsewhere. But at least they have these strategies that they adhere to over the long term. I think, part of that is maybe a function of the ancientness of Chinese civilization, where they just have a longer time horizon than Americans do, who are only, 300 years old or whatever, 350. And then there's also just the discipline that the CCP can impose on all elements of its government, right? Like democracy is more freewheeling, thank goodness. Like this is one of the things that protects our rights. You don't centralize power as significantly as something like the CCP does. But that does lead to challenge, and then we have these political cycles every 4 years or 8 years. So it does lead to challenges with things like strategy and strategic communications. But that's no excuse. We still have to be way, way better at this. Whereas the Chinese, again, are very disciplined. They do have a strategy, not always effective, but at least they're always working on it. And they're adaptive. We've seen it sort of shift and evolve over the decades as they've run into problems. They adapt to it. They try to address it, and then they're getting better and better at it.
Well, I'd have to agree with that from personal experience, having worked in 8 embassies across Africa, is that going back 20 years, I would say that the Chinese are evolving. They adapt, they learn. They're like AI. They're artificial intelligence. They really do adapt. I mean, I saw 20 years ago very ham-fisted stuff. Watching Chinese diplomats cozy up next to Africans and go, "Hey, we're just like you. We're brown too. We were colonized. These racists in the West. You should turn to us, brothers. Global South. All the very now that works with a certain element of certain elites. Right. They always fall for that, and it works. But it only gets you so far, and that only got the Chinese so far. So they realized that okay, that narrative works for some people, but we got to change it. And then they would just begin to focus on any time they did something. And initially, everything they did was in Mandarin, or and nobody understands what we're saying, So, but they just keep adapting and changing. But so there's a comment in here in the chat. I'm going to get to in just a second. But I just wanted to mention to people, folks, thanks for tuning in. You're listening to Chris Wyatt Africa on the Adopt Africa channel. My guest today is Josh from the Heritage Foundation. I didn't bother to say his surname, so I couldn't screw it up. And we're talking about China and Africa. That's an old broadcasting trick there. So, of course, you're not supposed to tell people. It kind of undermines the point. But anyway, my audience is easygoing. But let me get to this point in the chat. And then I think we want to shift the conversation after this to talk about what China is actually doing in Africa, how it approaches things regionally, bilaterally, and what I call the fallacy of the Chinese debt trap, because it's not China debt that's an issue. Some countries, Zambia maybe Djibouti, Angola, Djibouti, it's a real issue. But by and large, debt in Africa is a major problem for domestic lending. Most money in Africa is owned to banks and countries, not to foreign lenders. But so we'll get to the second. But the comment that was made here a few moments ago, let me find it very quickly. Leo Vinyasa van Rensburg said that even in South Africa, there's no USA is helping us. Everyone talks about China aid, never about USA aid. Exactly, because our embassy is like a neutered little eunuch that runs around and doesn't do anything and doesn't tell people what it does. They even try to downplay when they cut a ribbon at a counseling center, a testing center, or the military does something. They don't want any attention to it. And they need to quit walking in eggshells, in my view, because we give South Africa, not the country itself, but I mean, not the government, but South Africa gets $500 million on average from us over the last decade each year, mostly in healthcare sector, but also economic stuff. That's the first thing. That's government aid. But foreign direct investment, we continue to be the single largest foreign direct investor in South Africa to this day. And that's the case in Africa. Only recently have we been briefly overtaken as the single largest FDI investor in Africa. Now, to be fair, much of our FDI is in hydrocarbons. That's true. But the point is that we pour more money into Africa than any other country in the world, whether it's FDI or it's aid. And China's getting all this attention. Leovin's exactly right. People talk about China all the time, but not about. So let's shift the conversation a little bit, Josh. What China is doing in Africa at the strategic level, and then because down at the tactical level, it's not just the government doing things. It's also Chinese immigrants who marry local nationals on occasion, like in Mozambique, so they can get access to land, who are building a presence. And frankly, I've been arguing for the better part of 2 decades that every time the political elites and the left always talk about, neo-colonialism and Europeans, I'm like, show me the closed American colonies and communities in Africa. They don't exist. I can show you in Baghdad in the green zone, but not in Africa. But I can show you communities of only Chinese all over Africa, and they're colonizing Africa. Anyway, that was a lot.
So there's a ton of ways we could go about tackling this, but let's start the big strategic level here. I think Beijing, since independence really in 49, has recognized that Africa is of value to what Beijing's trying to accomplish. So initially, China was a revolutionary power. It wanted to see communist revolution, all over the world. They said that explicitly and openly. This isn't me putting on a tin hat or anything. And they saw Africa as the largest collection of developing states on the planet as sort of a natural ally in this cause. And it got them in a lot of trouble, frankly, because they supported armed groups all over the continent. They turned Ghana into this sort of hub for training revolutionaries that then undermined independent African states, right? So this was after colonialism in many cases. This was all about Mao trying to lead this global third world revolution, right? He wanted China to be the leader of this movement. So interestingly enough, that actually put him at odds with both the US, obviously, but also the USSR, right? The Soviets, because the Soviets were the other grand communist competitor or nation here that could potentially lead a global revolution. That started to change. We've already talked about how the Chinese government has adapted, over the years, and it realized it was getting into a lot of trouble, had very difficult relationships with a bunch of African countries. So they started to move away from that revolutionary model. Now, obviously, domestic Chinese politics are hugely important here because you had very tumultuous moments or eras like the Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution, which really caused the country to turn inward. they famously withdrew or shuttered all of their embassies except for the one in Cairo for a number of years. All of their embassies on the continent except for Cairo. But anyways, let's skip forward to sort of the current era here, where really I think 1989 was an inflection point where China had maybe forgotten about the importance of Africa to what it was trying to accomplish. And then Tiananmen Square happened, and the world was repulsed by the brutality of the Chinese military slaughtering peaceful students and other protesters, and condemned China. But Africa very quickly emerged actually as a source of diplomatic support for China during this time, because they had a lot of authoritarian regimes of their own that would have responded in exactly the same way and did treat their citizens in the very same way. So they actually became an important source of diplomatic support for Beijing. And that's when we saw the explosion of engagement that we've seen for the last, that was the start of the explosion of engagement for the last 2 decades. There's always been engagement since 49, right? Like, I'm not saying there was nothing, but we're seeing an explosion, right?
Well, Josh, that's sorry to interrupt, but that's one of the things that drove me nuts in DC with all the smart people. China and Africa. I'm like, dude, they've been here since the 60s. I mean, it's just that there's a major change. They didn't have any resources to do the things they're doing in this decade. It's only after we ironically sponsored their entry into the World Trade Organization, the United States, that they were able to abuse the WTO rules and put artificial and genuine barriers to products coming into their country to amass all this stuff with their mercantilist policies. And now they have all this cash and resources, human capital. They got to put it somewhere. And so it's natural for them to send it to Africa because they have these resources. But they've always been engaged. And all these people like China's coming to Africa. Dude, where have you been? They've been there for decades. It's just the scope and the scale of what they're doing is larger. But they would have always been like this, at least from after the Cultural Revolution, if they'd only had the resources and the focus.
Yeah, exactly. And I think what we see today is, look, I mean, like Africa's trade with China for China is just a tiny fraction of, it's hardly anything, right? It's just 1 or 2% or so. I don't even know what it is, and they don't source much of their petroleum anymore from the continent. That's been decreasing over the years. They do still get some, but not. It's Middle East is much more important. Yeah. But I think Africa has emerged, but it still remains really, really important to the Chinese government, and I think it is for a couple of reasons. One is and I already referenced this, the support that China derives for its international activities from Africa. You have 54 countries in Africa, and guess what? Each one of them has a vote in the UN, and their vote counts just as much as a major country accepting the permanent members of the Security Council, right? But in the UN, they can vote on really important issues. So Cabo Verde, right, their vote counts just as much as Germany's vote or something. And China's recognized that. And that's why they send very senior delegations, including up to the president, to the continent all the time, including to really small countries like Wang Yi, the foreign minister, visits really small African countries.
Like Togo, places like that.
Yeah, precisely. Yeah. Sort of famously for decades now, every single year, the foreign minister's first trip is included. The Chinese foreign minister's first trip has included Africa. President Xi, in his 2 terms, his first foreign trip included Africa. So they really put a lot of importance on the relationship with Africa, and I think it's because of this diplomatic support that they receive.
I think that's a fair point, because over time we had a time in which many African countries didn't recognize Beijing. And the one China policy is something they finally pretty much won. There's one holdout, and that is Eswatini. Eswatini is the only place that still recognizes Taipei as a legitimate ruler of China. That's kind of for Generation X and Y and Z. They don't even know what we're talking about because they don't even know this is an issue. But I mean, this has been an issue that's framed China policy for 60 years, one China policy. So they pretty much won that battle. So I agree with you that that's absolutely true, is that the support they get, that's important to them. And you mentioned the senior leaders. That's not only diplomacy, that's also strategic communications. China sends a message every time a foreign minister goes to Togo or Gabon or somewhere like that. And we have yet to send someone, in whatever administration, whatever time. Yeah, it's a big message. And they seem to get it. That FOCAC, their big conference every year, they
every 3 years,
every 3 years. Excuse me, every 3 years. I said every year. Every 3 years. But these things, China may have been ham-fisted at one time, but they get better and better and better. It's kind of like when it comes to products. When I was a kid, made in Japan was a derisive term. You didn't want anything made in Japan. And Nissan wasn't Nissan, it was Datsun, and they used to fall apart. And then suddenly Walkmans came along, and the Japanese made the best products in the world. We all wanted Japanese. Well, everybody laughed at the stuff coming out of Korea. It was all crap. But now we all want Samsung. Yeah, we got to have Samsung and LG. And the same thing in Taiwan. Oh, stuff made in Taiwan. They make the best semiconductors. And the list goes up. It's working your way up the value chain in quality. And this is what China's doing across the board, economically, diplomatically, and strategic communications.
Yeah, for sure. And it's all consonant again with their strategy, right? Like President Xi wants to return China to what he sees and many of the ruling cabal and many ordinary Chinese probably see as China's rightful place on the global stage, which is as an unassailable global power. Again, we have to remember, China is an ancient civilization, a proud one, and they have much to be proud of, right? Like, the art is extraordinary. The cuisine is wonderful. It's a beautiful, physically beautiful country, like all these things. The scientific discovery, et cetera, like everything that's come out of that civilization is genuinely extraordinary and laudable and admirable. And that's how they see themselves. And then they went through this century of humiliation, right? Where outside foreign dirty powers dominated them and humiliated that country and exploited it. And I think that has a very real bearing today on what the Chinese Communist Party is trying to accomplish. It wants to be certainly in the East Asian context, the undeniable, supreme, preeminent power, where maybe they don't entirely reconstitute the vassalage system that they traditionally had, but they have something that approximates it, right? Where these lesser civilizations like the Philippines and the Laotians and everyone else has to make their ritual obeisance and obey whatever China dictates to them. And they certainly don't want to ever be in a position again where foreign powers from the West can gainsay anything that Beijing wants to do. So that's the goal for foreign policy, right? Like is to and the term of art that they'll use is like the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, and so Africa is a part of that, right? Because Africa can lend very significant diplomatic support to what the Chinese are trying to accomplish at the UN, at other international fora. African countries are many of the signatories to these open letters that Beijing will distribute, lauding their activities in Xinjiang, where, of course, they're. I think it's. I think we can pretty accurately say they're waging a genocide against a religious and ethnic minority in Xinjiang. But African countries will laud that, or African governments, I should say, will laud that in these open letters. They will support China's position on arbitration around the South China Sea dispute, where China has this outrageous claim to the entire South China Sea. Essentially, it's ludicrous.
The 9 dash line. It's our territory.
It's ludicrous, right? It's like, well, one of our ancient admirals once sailed past this, ergo it's ours. It's like, it's foolishness, but that's what they do.
Better watch out Mozambique, because Cheng Ho got there in the 1450s. They might
exactly. Right, exactly. But again, African governments support this sort of thing, and they support China as it is trying to sort of impose its own norms and standards on really important, maybe esoteric issues, but really important issues around technical standards for the internet globally and things of that nature, data localization, et cetera, et cetera. So that's why I think China so values the relationship with Africa today. Again, yeah, sure, the oil, great, and there are important minerals, that are very critical to high tech, that China has prioritized as part of its development strategy. So cobalt, for instance, DRC produces about 60% of the world's cobalt. Chinese companies dominate the supply chain very consciously of that product. Cobalt's important, critical to lithium-ion batteries, which are in turn critical to autonomous vehicles and other things. So, there are some of those things, but really fundamentally, I think it's about the diplomatic support that Africa can give and does give to China. There's other things. I'm actually working on a piece right now about data mining that the Chinese government is almost certainly involved in on the continent. That's also quite important to them.
They are. They are.
Yeah, for sure. They're building the Africa CDC headquarters in Addis, and if you read about what happened there, Daily Maverick had a really good piece on this that looked at the fact that the normal procedure was completely circumvented in allowing China to build this thing. So why were they so eager to build the Africa CDC headquarters? Well, they're going to gather a bunch of genomic data. That's where it will be stored. And genomic data it will be the sort of data of the type that is very difficult for them to get in the Chinese context, right? Where you have virtually no Black people, very few people of African descent, but Africa is obviously a trove for that sort of data. And if you feed that into your artificial intelligence tech that you have, it refines that AI and then gives you an advantage in this critical technological space. AI has a billion applications that are important to the world and to the Chinese government. So, but again, fundamentally, I think it's about the diplomatic support and some of these other things that are also important, like the data mining opportunities and cobalt and et cetera.
Well, when I was at the African Union, U.S. Mission to the African Union in Addis, I cautioned people that we worked with. I said, you might want to be careful about what you talk about if you're talking about trade. And they said, what do you mean? I said, well, you notice that there's still a Chinese construction company here. The building's been completed for a few years now. There's no new construction going on. And Ethiopians are perfectly capable of maintenance in this building, but they're not allowed to do it. And also, you notice that the chairperson of the African Union Commission isn't allowed to go above a certain floor. Only Chinese engineers and technicians go to the top floors of this building. Yeah, what's your point? Well, I would just caution you about what you're saying, only to find out later on, widely reported, the Chinese put listening bugs, cameras, devices all over that building. So I intentionally would go through a few rooms and say a few things about China, just give them something to salivate over while I was there. It was a lot of fun. I was being cheeky, but it's a beautiful building. But they didn't build it. They didn't build it out of the generosity of their heart. Although I'm not saying the Chinese government isn't generous, but I'm saying that's not why they built it. They built it for strategic reasons. They have gained an advantage from people mistakenly letting things slip, what they think is a private conversation in parts of the building, and then they negotiate with the Chinese on trade and other issues, and they're working at a disadvantage because Chinese know their secrets already.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely correct. So I've written a report on this where I looked at how many sensitive government buildings Chinese companies have built in Africa. I found 186 confirmed.
That's scary.
There's more. Yeah, there's way more. I bet it's in the 300s.
Yeah.
I found mention of 60 others that the reference just wasn't solid enough for me to actually include it, and I couldn't find other supporting evidence. These are presidential residences, prime minister's offices, parliaments, ministries of foreign affairs, military installations, police installations. And so I wrote this report saying, look, this is a very obvious counterintelligence problem for African states, but also the US government, which does a lot of business on the continent. We send senior people over there. And there was some poo-pooing of that and skepticism of my conclusions in certain circles. And my because they say, well, you don't have any proof. It's like, well, you're right. I have not personally gone and swept these buildings with a wand to detect listening devices, and I haven't been able to do a forensic analysis of their ICT system that's accurate, right? And nor will I ever be able to do that. But I think we can piece together the evidence that we have, what we know about China's habits as far as espionage is concerned, surveillance is concerned, what we know about China's prioritization of the continent, what we know about the CCP's sort of acquisitive instincts for data and everything else. Like, this is a very well-known part of how the Chinese government operates, its surveillance and data mining. And frankly, I think it's far more plausible. I think it's far more implausible that they are not listening in on some of these buildings than otherwise. So, I hope that some African governments will start doing some of these sweeps of their buildings and of their networks. And I think the U.S. government should, offer to help as much as we can. Now, look, the U.S. government spies too. All countries spy. Of course. Like, all countries want to spy, right? Course. And if your government isn't spying, you should be concerned, frankly.
Exactly.
But what makes, what the Chinese government does unique is that they, the economic components of their espionage, right? Like, they actually steal trade secrets and try to determine people's negotiating strategies and everything else to advantage their company. This is very well documented in many different places. And that's unique. The United States does not do that. We don't have state-owned companies. We don't, the US government doesn't favor particular countries or companies rather in that way. Whereas the Chinese government has SOEs and national champions like Huawei, which are private. That's what distinguishes the Chinese government's activities here. And that's why the US needs to be really, really concerned about, the fact that a lot of these telecoms networks have been built by Huawei, especially, but also ZTE, ICT systems, including intragovernmental systems that are supposed to be secure. I think honestly, the continent is just absolutely just completely compromised as far as, Chinese intelligence penetration.
I would have to agree. I would have to say that the IT and the mobile telephony on the continent is infested with surveillance, and as you said, it's, we all do. We do espionage, we do surveillance, we do intelligence collection, even against allies and friends. I still find it comical that they were shocked that we were listening to Angela Merkel's telephone purportedly. Well, why would we not listen to Angela Merkel? She made some dumb decisions contrary to our national interest, and we're NATO allies. So if she's going to do that, but it's, look. That just people feigning, shock and like, well, that's just dirty. It's not dirty. That's what states do. Since 1648, we lived in a Westphalian system of states, and all these people want to talk about the erosion of state sovereignty. There is erosion, and particularly with social media and all this, ubiquitousness of communications certainly impacts sovereignty of states. But the sovereign state is still the entity in the global order to this day. And states should look out for their own interest. That doesn't mean if you collect intelligence, you're going to be a malicious actor. In the case of China, I think you hit exactly on it, is that China is doing it not because they want to conquer countries or they want to defeat them in a war, although maybe that's the case with Japan or South Korea, but or Taiwan, but certainly Taiwan. Yeah, certainly Taiwan, but probably not the case with Vietnam anymore because they got spanked last time, or with Thailand or with the USA even. But they're clearly doing it for advantage. And when you have parastatals, state-run institutions, that is reprehensible. I mean, that is industrial espionage, and we prosecute people for those crimes if they work for Toshiba, which we've done before. But I mean, that's what's happening there. And Africans find themselves, without even realizing it, at a competitive disadvantage because of information stolen from them unfairly by Chinese-sponsored actors. At least that's the argument.
Absolutely. Look, we've been talking about telecoms a lot, right? Let's keep talking about them. Huawei, they are heavily subsidized by the Chinese state. They absolutely benefit from stolen technology, stolen intellectual property. And then they use that to undercut competitors on price. One of the things you'll hear from African governments, and it's absolutely true, is that, well, Huawei's way cheaper. Yes, they are cheaper because they benefit from all of these anti-competitive, unfair practices. They have access to cheap capital from Chinese state banks. And this is true not just of Huawei, right, but also construction companies on the continent. Yep. I research a lot of the Chinese construction companies, and you will hear very vigorous protests from local operators in South Africa, Angola, yep. everywhere, right? Kenya, where they say, we can't compete with these massive Chinese companies because they are either explicitly state-owned, where they're fully bankrolled by the Chinese government, or they get preferential treatment in some way or another from Beijing, which makes it impossible for local companies to compete. And unfortunately, their own governments are not protecting them and not ensuring a level playing field. Look, I mean, Chinese companies deliver valuable stuff, right? Like their construction companies can put up a beautiful stadium and all of that. So that's not what I'm arguing here. What I'm arguing is that it's an unfair. There's not a level playing field on which to compete. And Chinese companies absolutely dominate the construction sector in Africa, and there's a host of reasons for that. Not all of them are because they're they benefit from anti-competitive behavior, but that is a big part of it as well.
No, absolutely. And that's, and let's be fair. I mean, this isn't China bashing. This is just China honesty.
No.
So, I mean, you're not bashing, I'm not bashing. And when I'm asked a question about China, I'm honest. China can deliver the best quality products in the world, consumer products. They can make fantastic phones. All those iPhones, they're not made in Cupertino. They're made in China. And the Chinese, but that's a Apple-owned factory under Apple supervision producing products for Apple in China. So in China, they're capable of making, but they're also capable of making the mobile phones where the buttons fall off of them, and the screen goes blank, and the battery's dead after 2 weeks, and they send flip-flops made out of toxic rubber that damage people's feet in Africa. So they're capable of a wide range of things. But for many years, Africa has been a dumping ground for inferior Chinese consumer products because they're inexpensive, and Africans in a lot of markets weren't sophisticated, couldn't afford them. But a lot of Africans have wised up to that now. So not China bashing. They can build great construction, but they can also build roads like they did in Monrovia that 3 months after they left, we already had 6 foot potholes in them once again. And one of the arguments in the chat that was brought up here is that one of the frustrations with Chinese, and I think this vacillates over time and has become less an issue, but it's still out there, is that, in the early days when they built a railroad in Botswana, they only brought Chinese labor over. And only Chinese did the work. No locals were employed. And all they did with the Botswana is they had liaisons with the Bush girls from the Bushmen and had mixed race kids, half Asian, half Bushman, and then left the country and left the kids behind. That's how people speak of them in Botswana. But the point is that they can build fantastic infrastructure, but they can also build terrible infrastructure. And for years, the Chinese were building a different gauge. They weren't using modern standard gauge for railroads, but they've gotten wise. Now the railroads in East Africa are all built with the standard gauge. So you can take rail cars built by Bombardier in Canada and put them on the rail lines that the Chinese are building in East Africa. So Chinese can do great stuff, but they can also do crap. And you have to be honest about what you're talking about.
Yeah, I think the key here is the African governments, right? Because if you have a responsible, competent African government that vigorously negotiates for its own interests, which doesn't always happen in these negotiations, but if it does indeed do that, and then if it has the ability and the will to monitor and evaluate and ensure that the Chinese companies are living up to the standards set in the contract, then you actually can get really good infrastructure. But if you have a deal that has been corrupted in some way by payments, or if by illicit payments, or if you have a government that doesn't have the capacity really to monitor what's going on, then you do end up in situations where you have roads washing out after 3 months, 6 months, a year, whatever. So I think the key again is the African governments. Like, The way I view this more broadly is Chinese companies are sharp actors, right? Like they are, and they're amoral. This is how I view the Chinese government, right? Like it's completely pragmatic, like that. It's just strictly business. Um, and so if they can make a little bit extra by using poorer quality concrete or something like that, they'll do that if they can get away with it.
Yeah.
But if you hold them to the standard, then no, they know they have to deliver on this, right? So
and they can.
that
They can. They can deliver on it.
Yeah,
That's the point. Yeah.
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. No, I mean, so
For
because
sure.
we have to be fair because I mean, and you and I are both being fair, but people either come down very hard on one side or the other. I think we're both being objective
Yeah.
here, and I think that's important for people to understand. The Chinese can build world class stuff. I mean, they really do. They put
Sure.
stuff in space. I mean,
Yeah.
they've got a satellite around Mars. It's being chased by Elon Musk. His car is going around chasing it.
Right. Yeah. And they can put up infrastructure very quickly, for instance. They are willing to operate in areas that Westerners would not operate, for instance. So there is that element. Now there is also the element we've been talking about where they do benefit from anti-competitive behavior from Beijing that really gives them a leg up. So it's a nuanced story as it always is, right? Like there's very rarely simple stories anywhere in the world, and including in foreign policy issues. But so it's complex, it's nuanced, and it's. But you have to dig into it, and you have to understand the nuances if we really want to grasp exactly what's happening here. And then from the U.S. perspective, figure out, okay, how in this context do we protect American national interests?
Absolutely. Now, a topic I broached earlier. Let's get to that before the day gets away from us, and that was the what I think is a canard. I mean, it's real in some places, like you and I briefly discussed Angola, Zambia, Djibouti, a few other places. But this whole talk about China using debt as debt servitude, debt enslavement, I disagree with that. I think it's a tool, and they use it, I think, effectively in many countries in Africa. But what's your thoughts on that? The debt trap that all the smart people are talking about.
Yeah. So look, debt trap diplomacy is a very catchy and frankly very effective piece of sloganeering. I understand the political reasons for using it. I don't think it actually reflects the reality of what happens. I think that I from what I've observed, I don't believe that Beijing is consciously trying to entrap countries in debt in order to seize their national assets. That's what debt trap diplomacy means, right? Now, I do think that China, there's been a combination of things happening as far as this debt issue is concerned. One, China has made really bad loans. I think they've just been reckless in some instances and given money on far too easy terms to governments that were bad bets. So part of it's just incompetence and inexperience, I think, on the continent. This is a hard lesson the West and others had to learn decades ago, but China hadn't learned it. The Chinese government had not learned it. Now, in other instances, I think, they are seeking political influence. I think that should be undisputable, right? Like they do use loans and cheap money to achieve political influence in certain countries that are important to them, like some of the ones we've mentioned. And then I think that they would, happily take like equity stakes or something in some of these assets if that was the best way to recoup their money. I think in the environment now, though, they would be crazy, and they're not crazy, to actually seize a national asset in an African country. If they took a port, or if they took an electrical grid or something like that, that would just kill them in Africa, because there is so much sensitivity around this debt trap diplomacy narrative. So I don't think they're going to do that. Now, I do think they're going to get their money one way or another, right? And we've already seen that in all these debt negotiations that are going on. So there have been restructuring deals struck. There's been a little bit of forgiveness, but it's always on these like zero interest loans that are a very small part of the portfolio. And I wouldn't be surprised if there's other deals, political deals, right, that get struck. They're like, okay, we'll forgive you this amount of money if you support us on this in this situation, right? I wouldn't be surprised if you have those sort of quid pro quos going on. But fundamentally, the debt problem is a problem for China because they made a bunch of bad bets. They're now faced with a whole boatload of bad debt coming due on the continent. They're scrambling around, trying to figure out how to deal with it. They have to restructure, et cetera, et cetera. It's really bad for their image. And so I'm very curious to see how they're going to continue to approach this. Again, I think we'll see a bunch of restructuring and that sort of thing. It'll all be opaque, of course. It always is. It'll be hard to figure out exactly what happened. But it's a challenge for Beijing because they got themselves into this mess in many ways. And I honestly sometimes think, we so often frame this as China taking advantage of African states, and that is absolutely a dynamic. I wonder if Beijing got taken for a ride in a few of these instances as well.
Oh, they did.
You know what I mean?
No, I don't wonder. I know they got taken for a ride, and you kind of hit on it there. I agree that I think that by and large, Chinese banks and Chinese state agencies have been far more astute in the past 5 years when it comes to lending in Africa. It's been a lot more business oriented from a standpoint. What are we going to get out of this? I'm not just going to give money to get influence. I mean, although that's part of it, but I got to get something out of it. Like the railroads that they're building in East Africa, they see a payoff in that, and that's why they're going after it. So I think that's an important point. It is, when it comes to the debt thing, that's why I wanted to raise the issue with it. Is that I think a lot of people don't really understand debt. When you hold debt, that puts you in a vulnerable position at times too, and that's what's happened in China here with some of these loans in Africa. But not just that. Remember, a couple years ago, all the smart people were saying that, well, the U.S. will have to do what China says because they hold all our debt. Okay, first off, that's factually incorrect. 67% of federal debt in this country is owned to U.S. institutions, retirement funds, insurance companies, and Americans. So we own 2/3 of our debt. If we're going to default, we'll default on ourselves and we'll pay our foreign debt so our currency doesn't collapse. So that's the first thing. China did become the largest single foreign country holding our debt instruments at the federal level, but only briefly. Because they held so much in the way of T-bills and T-bonds, they surpassed the UK and then Japan, which Japan has historically been the highest for decades. And they went past them at just around 9%. And then they had too much money in their hands, and they were worried about it. So they started selling off, and they once again dropped down to being the second largest holder of our foreign debt. So here's the thing. If China wants to threaten us about the debt, we'll just threaten to cancel it, and they will suffer far more than we will because they don't have the hard currency reserves to back it up. All they have is IOUs from the U.S. Treasury. There's no dollars in those bank accounts. So, in fact, and no silver or gold or platinum. So, if China wants to play hardball, at the end of the day, they lose as much or more than we do. So, I think it's a canard, and I think we kind of agree. Tell me if I'm wrong, but about this being a canard in the context of Africa too. The Chinese are in as much difficult a position as Africans find themselves in vis-a-vis this debt.
Yeah, I mean, I think fundamentally it is a bigger problem for the African countries, obviously, just because, you talk about the size of the economies, there's just no comparison at all. So, Zambia's already gone through this. They defaulted. Now they've been probably already, I'm sure they've been already downgraded. I haven't followed closely enough, but that's going to make it more expensive to borrow. So these are poor countries. This is bad. This is very bad for them, to be obvious about it. But again, China still has poverty in its own country. Oh, yeah. When we still have all these problems here domestically. Now, again, the CCP is an authoritarian, brutal regime, so there's not going to be much opportunity for people to really express their displeasure about these things. But the CCP does keep its finger on the pulse of these sorts of currents, and they do respond to them sometimes, not because they care, about what their people think for its own sake, but they care about their own longevity and power, and their people do have some say over that. So Yeah, I think, again, like I said earlier, I'm really interested to see how China is going to handle these issues. And you mentioned this earlier, and it's worth repeating. I think it's only a few countries actually we're talking about here in Africa that have where China is a really significant part of their debt problem. Now, China is by far the largest bilateral lender to the continent, but you also have a lot of commercial debt and things that are huge parts of the portfolios. So, uh, as I said, I think we're going to see restructurings, things of that nature. We've already seen it in Ethiopia, for instance, where they restructured some of their debt. And to put a point on what you said earlier about China sort of wising up in the last 5 years, we've talked about the standard gauge railroad, right, in Kenya between Mombasa and Nairobi. Very interestingly, Beijing refused to fund the second leg of that. The Mombasa and Nairobi is just the first leg. Sure. I think it actually goes to Naivasha at this point, but that's just the first section. There's supposed to be more. It's going to connect with Uganda and some others, and Beijing said no. Yeah. So I think they are becoming much tighter. They've tightened up on their lending. And I think they're starting to learn some of the lessons that other countries have learned over the years when engaging with some of these African governments that are very poor stewards of their national assets and are not particularly reliable as far as borrowers go.
In fact, that project you're talking about has caused a great deal of anger in East Africa because it was sold as a project from Mombasa to Nairobi to Kampala to Kigali and to link that East African arc, which would be brilliant. And that was the idea. And as you said, they've balked at this now. So there's a lot of anger, not just in Rwanda and in Uganda, but also in Kenya because they wanted that link as well. The time has gotten away from us, and this is a fantastic conversation. But I did want to, we can stay longer, but I did want to ask you something, your thoughts on this, and then get some final thoughts, unless you want to stay a little bit longer, or you're able to. But the first thing I want to ask you before we get to your final thoughts is, so people always ask me, why is China in Africa? Well, I mean, they're a sovereign state. They have interests, right? I mean, they're there. And over time, I believe their interests have always been universal or, holistic, but they have had a different focus or morphed over time.
Yeah.
So we've noticed here in the middle part of the Odd Decade, the Chinese realized that it was good PR for them and smart for them to get engaged in peacekeeping. The first time they ever got in UN peacekeeping mission was in Liberia. And that went very well for them. They sent engineer battalions there. They got lots of good press. They put the People's Liberation Army to a good use. And okay, this is good. Then they got in South Sudan. Didn't go so well there, but they got engaged in that. So they've refined over time. But ultimately, for Africa, why would it matter strategically? I've told people for years, number one, it's an outlet for consumer products, particularly inferior consumer products, because people aren't going to buy those in Santa Monica or in London, flip-flops that fall apart. So that's a place for the consumer products. It's a place for natural resources. But an overlooked aspect of this, and this is where I'd like to get your take, that I've been telling people for a couple of decades, and I've been focusing on it more over the last decade, is that as China has rapidly grown its economy, it had to put its engineers and its scientists and its technicians to work and its labor to work in construction and development, things like that. And they built all these cities that are empty in China because and you can only do that for so long before you cause a serious problem in your economy. And eventually they had to have some place to send their excess human capital, their engineers, their architects, and Africa's a great place for that. And you get a lot of benefit from that. You get good relations because you've delivered a product. You get a foothold in a country, and you get influence potentially there, and you potentially open up new markets. And so that's one of my arguments, is that Africa's also been a place for China to dump is not the right term, but that's what I'm going to say. To dump their excess human capital that they need to get working and not sitting around doing nothing in China, and their actual capital, the dollars that they have, instead of sitting on all this money, put it to work because it's not doing anything. Do you agree with that take, that it's a place for China to take advantage of that, or no?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely part of it. So you're completely correct. We got to remember, China, even 50 years ago, had terrible infrastructure and they went through the Cultural Revolution and the Great Leap Forward, just these disastrous policies that killed many millions and set the country back decades. But then, they went on this extraordinary infrastructure building spree. and they had these huge companies that developed as a result. Chinese construction companies are massive. I had no idea until I started researching them several years ago.
Yeah, I thought that Bechtel was big, but they're starting to look kind of small by comparison.
Yeah, totally. And so but now they've built pretty much most of the infrastructure. There's still, there's always infrastructure to be built, but they've built, the great majority of it that they're going to need for quite a while. But you still have these very large companies that are very important politically as well. Just because of the sheer number of people that they employ, but also how powerful the leadership of these countries are. Now, again, the CCP is the all-powerful entity. Anyone who tries to cross them very quickly discovers that they are lower on the totem pole than the CCP. Jack Ma being the most recent example, right? Like China's single most famous and wealthy person has been taken down several pegs. But these construction companies are still important politically. Now, what's a place that needs a lot of infrastructure? Well, Africa, obviously. Africa has this immense infrastructure gap. So, I think in the construction sector, this was an opportunity to keep those companies going, to keep them, keep their equipment engaged and everything else. So they were offloading excess capacity in Africa for sure. And they've, there's an interesting debate around infrastructure, whether that is really the best way for a country to develop, right? So is just building a bunch of infrastructure the best way for a country to leap forward economically? The Chinese think it is because that was essentially their model. But again, the West had been building infrastructure in Africa for many years, long before the Chinese got there. And they abandoned that approach and that model. And they started focusing on things like governance and systems, because they came to the correct realization, I would say, that you can build all the infrastructure you want, but if you have poor governance, it's just going to crumble. It's not going to get maintained. It's not going to be a good investment. You're not going to get this healthy return on the ROI that you want. So you have to focus on these systems that are supposed to be governing this process and buttress those before you can really do intensive infrastructure. Now, that's not to say you should ignore infrastructure. That's not, people do indeed need roads and telecommunications networks and everything else. But as far as a focus is concerned, I'm skeptical, right, that the infrastructure-led approach is the right one for Africa because of this governance problem. But that is how China does believe that the infrastructure-led development approach is the way to go. It also benefits them, again, to get their company's business on the continent. This is the thing about Chinese engagement is that it integrates all streams of engagement to be mutually supportive. So their diplomatic efforts support their economic efforts, which support their military, and it just goes in a circle. And so as they've offloaded excess capacity, as you mentioned in your question, sort of leading up to this, they've also developed the political influence. A lot of times these companies have served as a beachhead for other Chinese companies to then get involved. So there's a lot of reasons to do it, but one for sure is offloading this excess capacity.
Yeah, no, I agree, obviously, with everything you said there. It's one of the things I've been telling people for years, and it's not a mischievous or evil thing. It's just a reality. You've got
right.
Yeah, I mean, if you have a brain surgeon that never does brain surgery, you don't wait 10 years and say, okay, now do your surgery. If you have an architect that doesn't design anything for 10 years, that's not good. So I mean, if they can bring them to bear somewhere, that may be benefiting the Africans. But I'll tell you, when it comes to construction, you're all over that. I remember in the build up to the 2010 FIFA World Cup in South Africa, all of the construction being done in Botswana is being done by Chinese companies. Not because they were competitive, but because they're the only one offering bids on the tenders. And that was because all of the Botswana-based construction companies had gone to South Africa to compete for the stadium refits and build-outs. And so virtually everything in the region was focused on, building up South Africa for the World Cup. And the Chinese came in, and then they built relationships and built like the Seretse Khama Airport in Gaborone, and the list goes on and on. But they did fill a need because there was no one else to do it at the time. But by the same token, when we built a voluntary counseling and testing center in Francistown, and I went to the site where I spent $500,000 US building this so that Botswana could get proper counseling and testing. Thank you, Gana, for subscribing to the channel. That just came up. I went to the site and asked to speak to the foreman. The only person there was a guy who didn't speak English. He didn't speak Afrikaans. He didn't speak Setswana. He only spoke Mandarin, and he was dismissive and disappeared when I tried to ask him questions after he finished his cigarette. And that's what I was dealing with, because the contractor we hired didn't have the labor. I didn't do the contract. It was done before I got there. So he hired Chinese to do all the work. And then he didn't supervise the site. So anyway, but to be fair, it was a nice counseling test center. They did a good job. It was money well spent. But anyway, so Josh, it's been a fascinating conversation. I've really enjoyed it with you. I want to thank you for coming on.
Me too.
And for your flexibility. I mean, I had flexibility because you had an issue to deal with, and you had flexibility because I had an issue to deal with. and here we are. We finally got to do it. And I think the audience found it interesting. Good ratio of likes. People enjoyed it. Great comments. By the way, a number of comments were deleted by AI during this. Whenever people said certain things about China, their messages were deleted. I know that because I saw them repost it. I've got screen captures of that. So that is happening. I've already talked to Google about that. But you're welcome back on the channel anytime, and we can discuss some other issues about Africa if you'd like, focus on another area. But I'm going to give you a chance for final thoughts, and then I'm going to ask you if you can, we'll wrap up there, and then I'll just stay on as you drop off to wrap up my program, okay? So any final thoughts?
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me on. I genuinely enjoyed the convetion. Thought it was super interesting. We could talk for days, actually, about China and Africa.
That's the hazard. That's why I have to call this.
I mean, we barely scratched the surface here. But I do hope it was, illuminating for people who are listening. And, this is a challenge. We've talked about this mostly as a challenge for the United States, which it is. But it is a challenge for African countries as well, who I'm not at all, I don't believe in this idea of like, well, you have to choose, the US or China. Like, that's foolishness. Every country has its own national interests and needs to do what's best for those. But I do hope that African governments are thinking through some of these challenges deeply and carefully. And I know many are. Fundamentally, though, I think it's up to the African people themselves to make sure to hold their own governments accountable for striking good deals with the Chinese government, for ensuring that their governments are monitoring these programs and are getting the best possible deal for the African people that they're supposed to be serving. And I think the best way to do that is to demand transparency on these interactions between, the African governments and the Chinese government. They're usually opaque. They're usually entirely hidden, or you only get a few details here and there, and you have to ask yourself, why is that? And so I do think it's up to the African people to really hold their own governments accountable for protecting their interests when dealing with China and with any country, frankly, right? Like
with the U.S.,
any country at all.
With the U.S.,
yeah, totally. So this applies to everybody here. Anyways, so absolutely was thrilled to be on. People can find my work at the Heritage website or follow me on Twitter. Always happy to engage with folks there, and would love to come back and continue chatting about this or any other thing that's relevant.
All right, Josh. I think that I might have neglected to put your link in at Heritage, and I know I didn't put your Twitter in because I don't know if I'm linked to you on Twitter, but I will put that in the video description after the stream. I'll do that today so that people follow it later. They can find your links, or they can just search for you on Google. It's Josh Meservey.
Yeah, nailed it.
Opa! Yikes. Anyway, no, Josh, it was a great pleasure for me, and I'm glad we finally got a chance to get around to it, despite the technical challenges and such. So we'll get you back on sometime, perhaps maybe soon. Thanks a lot, and thanks for the work you folks do at the Heritage Foundation. I think a lot of people genuinely appreciate it.
Well, thank you. That's kind of you to say, and thank you for the work you do. And we'll keep plugging away and doing the little things we can to make the world a little bit better.
Awesome. And there you go, a former Peace Corps volunteer. You got to love that. Oh, but before you go, real quick, when you said you did Peace Corps in Zambia, then you went somewhere else. Was that with the Peace
Kenya.
Corps? Was that with the Peace Corps too?
No, that
okay,
was with an NGO that did refugee work.
No, the reason I ask is because I know that the Peace Corps doesn't usually take people on a second tour, but a small number of people are in a program that come and they kind of like supervise people in regions. I was wondering if that's what it was. Okay.
Yeah, no, different.
Okay. Well, thanks a lot for your efforts in Africa and for what you do at the Heritage Foundation, Josh. And we'll catch you next time here on Chris White Africa.
Awesome. Can't wait.
All right, I'll let you drop off. Thanks a lot, Josh. And then I'll wrap up the program, ladies and gentlemen. Lots of great comments for Josh and people saying thank you, complimentary. I appreciate the kind words for Josh, and thank you all for tuning in. Thank you for the likes, for the questions. Couldn't get to some of them. My apologies. We did see them. I tried to incorporate them into my questions, and we did get to some of them. Also, I did notice that people's comments were being deleted, and they put them back in there. So that I didn't miss that, folks, and that wasn't my moderators. There was a moderator who took out somebody's comment, but most of that wasn't the moderators. That was not us. It wasn't me. I deleted one comment because it was off topic, and I saw that one of my moderators deleted one comment because it was off topic as well. But the rest of lots of messages being pulled out, it wasn't us doing that. So apologies for that, but I have no control over that. You'll have to take it up with Alphabet, Google, or YouTube. Anyway, folks, thanks for tuning in. I did not have the news of the day, so I'm going to end this, and then I'm going to do a Stray Voltage live stream unannounced in just a few minutes after I get up, stretch my legs. I'll come back. If you want to catch the news, it'll be on. If you're unable to catch it right now, you can catch it later on because I'll upload it. It'll already be uploaded. So I'm going to do Stray Voltage news of the day, short program here shortly. So if you want to catch that, tune in. And there will be a Night Owls edition of Stray Voltage later today, this afternoon, or this evening in South Africa. Remember, folks, here in the U.S., we spring forward this weekend, the 14th of March, and we are 1 hour closer to Europe and Africa. So that cuts the gap for South Africa from 7 to 6 hours, at least temporarily, and we'll be back in sync with you a little bit better. And in Europe, whether it's UK, 5 to 4 hours, Central Europe, 6 to 5 hours. So that's coming up here very soon on Sunday, the 14th of March. Thanks a lot, folks. Appreciate you tuning in. And I'll be back shortly with the news of the day, Stray Voltage and Daba Africa news of the day. Thanks a lot. My thanks to my special guest, Josh, who was awesome. Really enjoyed the conversation. I hope you did as well. Please feel free to share this stream with anyone you like. Let them learn a little bit about China and Africa. And notice that we didn't bash on China. I think we were objective. We pointed out things China does well and also the things that are a challenge for China as well as the United States and African countries. Anyway, folks, thanks a lot. God bless. We'll catch you here next time shortly if you want to come back on Chris White Africa. And that is it. Let me make sure I got everything shut down here so I don't try to close the window and then get surprised by something that's up. No, okay, we're good to go. All right, that's it, folks. Thanks. We'll catch you here shortly. God bless.